Here are 5 things you don't need to be a wildlife gardener. Number 1, you do not need loads of money. I don't have loads of money. I've never had loads of money. I'm pretty much living paycheck to paycheck like most people. And yet I'm able to do wildlife gardening. And the reason for that is you don't actually have to spend any money to do wildlife gardening. Now, if you have any kind of outdoor space at all, chances are it is already a wildlife garden in a way. And I bet there are wildlife that just come to your garden anyway. But wildlife garden is all about optimizing your space for the local wildlife. And one of the most important things to do, arguably, is provide a water source for wildlife. So wildlife, especially in very hot weather where water might have dried up elsewhere, or in very cold weather where water might have frozen over, providing water for wildlife can be a lifesaver for the wildlife around you. So, and all you need to do that is just to get a container, a shallow container, which I'm sure you have somewhere in your house anyway, and put some fresh water in it every day. You can use like a plant pot tray or an old sort of shallow plate, or like an old dustbin lid or something like that. Just needs to be shallow so that animals don't get stuck in it. And then you've got like a source of water that they can drink from, and have a bath in and all that sort of thing, and that's free. And that's probably like the most important thing you could do. So you totally don't need loads of money. Number 2, you do not need loads of time. Traditional gardening does require quite a lot of time. You have to spend, a lot of time maintaining your garden and doing all the things that traditional gardeners do to keep it under control, to keep it how you want it to look, so it can take a fair bit of time, depending on the space that you have. But wildlife gardening is like the opposite of that. Wildlife gardening is about letting your garden be as natural as you're comfortable it being. And the more natural it is, the less you have to do to it. You're just leaving it. So it's ideal for people who want to have a natural space. They want to help wildlife, and you actually do that by doing less in your garden. It's great. I mean, I'm busy. I've got several different jobs. I've got kids. I'm actually quite lazy as a person. I don't know if that's the right... Yeah, I am in a way, but another way of saying it, I guess, is I value my rest. I need rest. I don't have all the time in the world to do things. When it comes to wildlife gardening, it's about leaning into the fact that Mother Nature knows best. In traditional gardening, you're kind of trying to plant things that wouldn't maybe naturally grow there. And you're trying to, you often are killing off weeds or things that, would naturally want to grow in that area, and you're fighting it, and you're kind of fighting against nature a little bit. I'm not saying I don't do that at all, because my garden, tiny though it is a multifunctional space. I've got to say, most of it is lawn. Because I do have kids, I like them to go out there to be able to play, and I like to be able to sit out there in the summer. I like to have friends around in the garden and all that sort of thing. So my garden is definitely, partially a managed garden. But what I try to do is I try to make the borders, around the edge, more wild. Just kind of leave them. I try and add things occasionally that I think will have a benefit to wildlife, but otherwise I'm just sort of leaving it to do what it wants as much as I can. And that, that's just freeing up your time. And, that's what makes sense. 3, you do not need loads of space. I have a garden that is just a couple of meters square, out the back, and out the front I wouldn't even class it as a garden. That is just like, you've got my window, you've got about a foot of dirt, and then you've got the fence, and that's the space that I've got. Although arguably that is the space that gets the most wildlife. If you've seen my new series, the Secret Camera series, that is mostly from that tiny patch of ground out of the front of the garden. So you can see from that, you do not need to have loads of space. This is actually the first property I've lived in with a garden. Up until then, I've always lived in a flat. So you don't even need a garden. You can have just like a balcony or even just a window box that you can optimize for wildlife. 4, you do not need to have loads of gardening skills, or like barely any. Despite the fact that I have a wildlife gardening channel, I have quite a lot of knowledge about wildlife, not so much about gardening, and you don't need it for the reasons that I've said previously. It's about kind of letting things go, letting things be wild. Mostly, I do try to plant things that I think will be of a benefit to wildlife, and I have the same knowledge that I think most people have, and that's it. You know, I know if you put a seed in the ground and you add water and sunshine and maybe a bit of compost, it'll grow, or it won't grow, you know. And if it doesn't grow, I don't really push it. Then I'll try something else that will naturally fit, you know, in the space. I've got to say though, being transparent, my husband does have some traditional gardening skills, you know, and he does mow the lawn. He does deal with the compost heap, and he did help me with recently. I just planted a whole bunch of spring bulbs, you know, and I didn't even I wasn't even completely sure how to do that because I didn't really have the skills, and he was just able to say, oh, you just do this, and it's, you know, it was easy. You just made a little hole in the ground, put a little bit of compost in, popped in your bulb, cover it over, job done, you know. So yeah, you definitely do not need to be an expert gardener or anything even close to be a wildlife gardener. Number 5, you do not need to live in the countryside to have a wildlife garden. In fact, I would argue that having a wildlife garden in a built up area is way more valuable to your local wildlife. So, for example, I live kind of half and half. I live in a very busy housing estate, but on the edge, and that housing estate is in turn on the edge of a village. So I've got countryside sort of butting onto my sort of the side of my house on one side, and then on the other side I've got, you know, the housing estate. And I'd say that because I live near the countryside, yeah, I do get some animals that maybe you wouldn't so much in a built up area. But there's also some that I don't see because of where I live. So for example, the reason that living in the countryside with wildlife garden might sort of backfire in a way is that you're surrounded by countryside, and why would a wild animal who has the natural countryside to choose from come to your garden? So a lot of animals will still, because they like the supplementary food that you provide, but others will avoid it. So a good example will be hedgehogs. So I've been trying to attract hedgehogs to my garden this autumn for the first time, and I've come up against, you know, nothing. They've not been here. And discussing it with some other YouTubers in the wildlife gardening space, I've come up with some other people who've also had the same issue, and they suggested, and I think it's right, that if you live next to the countryside, it's right there, why would a hedgehog come to your garden when it's got all it needs over there? So my house, I'm very, very lucky to live just opposite a small patch of woodland, and then there's like a big bit of grass, and then there's the front of my house. But when you think about it, that's not great for getting hedgehogs to my garden, because they've got a lovely habitat over there. Why would they want to leave it? They've then got a bare patch of grass, which they would have to come across being very exposed, which hedgehogs don't like. They like to keep to hedgerows and edges. And we also get a lot of foxes on that piece of grass. So in the way, it's like the killing fields for hedgehogs. Why would they come across to my garden? It's just not worth it for them. However, hedgehogs are most commonly seen in suburbs and villages, you know, in the built up areas, because they like those edges, you know, they like those edges, and they're looking for somewhere in that area that's green and is going to be really good for them. So in that instance, in the villages, in the suburbs, people's gardens are absolutely perfect for them. And if you live in that environment, that is where you are most likely going to see a hedgehog, whilst me on the brink of the countryside, not so much. I don't know if I'm ever going to get hedgehogs in my garden. We shall see. I hope you found this video useful and encouraging. If I can do wildlife gardening, anybody can. And if you'd like to see how our wildlife garden is getting on, check out our A Year in the English Wildlife Garden playlist. At the time of recording, this is November 2025. So if you'd like, I'll put a link in the description of our new wildlife garden tour if you'd like to check that out. But otherwise, yeah, please do subscribe for lots of different wildlife gardening content. Okay. Okay, see you next time.